we're now moving into Hawaiian cultural landscapes, Hawaiian built environment. This is probably a huge jump in many ways because we're moving from a highly structured, highly organized, highly built environment, especially if you think of the suburbs, but even Williamsburg in the colonial period. And we're now moving to a society which was very much more integrated with the landscape. Though the landscape was hugely modified, it wasn't done usually with buildings in the classic Western sense. It was modifications of the landscape rather than putting things on the landscape. So very different, and probably especially for a Western mindset, a lot of the landscape tended to not look like it had been modified because it wasn't modified in European sensibilities, not surprisingly. The other aspect that's important to remember when we're looking at this stuff is that we're going through a huge amount of material real quickly. Now, of course, we did with the European, but I think for most folks, there's sort of a context. We're familiar with the building patterns. It's just a matter of sort of noting things. With the Hawaiian cultural material we're going through, most folks really aren't going to have any idea where this is coming from. So you're just going to have to sort of take it on faith, I guess. Much of this is covered in more detail in the Hawaii class, the Anthropology 340. But a lot of it's just sort of a summation of a huge amount of material out there. So it's just, I strongly suggest you take a look at it. I would recommend Kamakawa's Hawaiian History if you're interested in the actual dynamics of chiefs and the sort of development of the Hawaiian political social system. I'd also recommend Martha Beckwith's Hawaiian Mythology. Superb work done in the 20s and 30s, actually very in-depth looking at the major stories that sort of were embedded in the landscape. Then it's very accessible, very good read. And of course, Charlot's Chanting Universe, which is a sort of, I would read that last, sort of a more synthetic one. So with that, just a note, I've got my website up here. There's some access here to various projects that we've worked on. The Old Hawaii project, the project we're currently working on, the Palolo Waititi Cultural History Service project. Both of these are based in Google Earth and have downloads of all the files we have that we're working on to date. Both of these give you some insight into how Hawaiians used the landscape. The Old Hawaii project in the pre-contact period, the Palolo Waititi project, and sort of what you might call the pre-contact right into the 1840s, 1850s. And the key thing that are useful, especially in the Waikiki Palolo Waititi one, is that you actually get a chance to see some in-depth interaction in terms of Hawaiian use of landscape. I guess I should also point out that game, I'm not sure games are really properly termed. It's a game in the same way that chess is. A very good illustration of the Hawaiian concept of place and the Hawaiian use of place and imagery in very non-Western ways would be in Konane, which again, we've done a whole series on. So again, you can take a look at all that. Key points I want to make here, just because I want to mention them now, because otherwise confusion will be worse. We're summarizing an enormous amount of change in an enormously complex area. The Hawaiian Islands are seen as a package deal in the modern Western sense. They're a state, they were a monarchy, they were a territory. But the reality is the Hawaiian Islands vary tremendously, not only from island to island, but even region to region on each island. And this is typical in all of Polynesia. There's a real European, or such say Euro-American attitude that islands have to all be the same because they're bounded by water, while so are continents. So the Hawaiian existence was a very complicated and a very diverse one from one region to the other. Even linguistically, the type of Hawaiian spoken on Kau was very dialectically audibly different than what you would hear, for example, in East Maui or say on Encino, was and actually still is in large part. So the idea that there's one package or there's one Hawaiian or there's one way of being Hawaiian is very much an artifact of the 20th, 21st century stereotyping and sort of a whole mess of modern dynamics, which really aren't part of this class, except when we get into sort of the imagery or symbolism of it. So the other thing that's important to remember is Hawaiian society was not static. Polynesians did not arrive Hawaii, bring up the world of the Marquesas to the Hawaiian Islands and just sort of plop down waiting for Cook to show up in 1778. Hawaiian society went through an enormous very, very complex dynamic system of changes, not the least of which is adapting a Polynesian lifestyle that was totally not suited for life in Hawaii, given the environmental distinctions or environmental variants. So Hawaiians didn't live in a typical Polynesian world. It was very much a different. It's also important to understand very quickly that somewhere in the 1500s, and this is throughout all of Polynesia, not just Hawaii, um, there was an internal religious movement. In other words, there was very much what we call a prophetic religious movement that occurs, started in the Marquesas, moves through central eastern Polynesia, and comes up to Hawaii in the 1500s. This had enormous social, religious, and political changes. The system that Cook bumps into in the 1778 as a result of the religious social changes that occurred from this new religious movement. And so this had enormous changes, most spectacular in terms of relationships that people had with the world around them. So it wasn't just a version of what had existed. Hawaiian society, when this new religion was brought up by the missionaries from southern central Polynesia, um, completely radicalized Hawaiian society. And from island to island, it had very different impacts. The Western islands, west parts of Oahu, but specifically Kauai, Niihau, really didn't buy into the new religion in a lot of ways. The Eastern Islands, specifically the Big Island, but also Central East Maui, really became believers, if you would, of this new religious movement. And so the islands ended up being very divergent, not only because just they're distinctively different, anyways, but also which of these religions they embraced, and this had enormous changes in how they saw their relationship with the landscape and each other. So if we go back to the old system, the system that Polynesians brought up and with some modifications was pretty much around till the changes of the 1500s. There's several things that are really important to understand. And one of these is the idea of clan. Clans are very typical. Most of the world's populations exist in clans. Having said that, a large chunk of Europeans and almost all Euro-Americans aren't clan-based. And this makes it very hard for Americans to understand that if we were teaching the same class in Japan or China or even Highland Scotland, it would be very easy because people would immediately understand what the word means. It's a technical term in anthropology, but it's also a very important concept. It's central to the way that people see their kinship relations. So there's two ways that you can look at your family in terms of kin relations. One would be the idea of lineage, and this would be a genealogy chart. This would be how Americans tend to see, Euro-Americans tend to see their world. You have a family tree, you have the people in it, people are related by marriage or birth, you got your cousins and your aunties and uncles, etc. And you can map the whole thing out. The key thing with lineage is talking about existing real people. They might be dead, but they existed. And so they exist in memory and they exist in concept and they exist, in some way, shape, or form existed in the real world. This is very much a minority view. I grew up in a clan system. Clans have the idea of lineage. So it's not like you don't have lineage, but you have another more powerful or more central concept on top of that. And that's the idea of the clan. The clan looks like a lineage, so it'll have a genealogy tree, but the key with the clan is the genealogy tree includes people that, one, aren't people, two, don't die usually, and three are actually the only owners of the landscape. So in a clan system, and we'll just use the Hawaiian one since we're talking about it anyways, in a traditional Hawaiian clan, for example, and the best example I can think of is always Kahana. That particular section of the island of Oahu, that particular valley, was basically made by the pig god Kamapuaa. Now, he was one of the gods that was around when the landscape was sort of unformed. So the island was there, but it was sort of like a lump of clay. And so what happens is that particular god, who could, as most of the gods could take various forms, was apparently lonely, bored, whatever. And so in that context, what he does is he first shapes the land. So he's having a good time goofing around with his girlfriend, Pele, girlfriend at the time, though later ended up with a really ugly divorce. And they're rolling around having a good old time, and that makes the valley. So the valley is made by the movements of the gods. So the valley is not seen as a geologic feature. It's seen as a feature that's actually shaped by individuals. At a later date, she's in the back of the valley, and so the water coming down Kahana Stream is actually put there by the god Kamapuaa. One of the things that Kamapuaa was famous for was fertility. So areas that were heavily green, places that had a lot of rain, a lot of those areas were seen as fundamentally built for the pigs. So they didn't exist prior to the god putting them in. So one of the key differences between this and sort of Western religion is you don't have a God doing everything. If you go back to our Calvinist, in the clan-based concept, which you have is a bunch of different sort of divine, spiritual things that make different parts of the landscape. So Kamapuaa makes the valley, he puts the stream in, he gives it the vegetation, basically. He makes Kahana into what it is now. Now, at some point after that, he populates it. So he populates it with two versions of himself, because again, he could take multiple forms. I suppose maybe you call them shape changers. I'm not sure what you call them. So one of the forms that he took, and the senior one, is the pig. Not surprisingly, he's the pig god. So he puts pigs in the valley. Now, all those pigs are part of his. They're his children. So they're not like things that he just, made out of clay. They're actually part of him. He then goes and takes his second form, which is a people, and puts people in the valley. So for the Hawaiians that lived in Kahana, they were the children, literally the Keiki o Kamapuaa, and they were his children. He was their great, great, great grandfather. He was the founder of them. He was also the founder of the pigs in the valley, which is one reason why traditionally, if you're one of the families that lived in Kahana, you didn't kill pigs and you would have never had Kaloa pig, because that would be cannibalism. You'd be eating your relatives. You could eat other stuff, but you couldn't eat pig. So what you go is, if you move across the Hawaiian landscape, then, and this was typical in all of Polynesia. In fact, it's found in all the Pacific. This is very typical in Asia. Large parts of Europe were, in some cases, still are clan-based. So what you have is landscapes become shaped by things. Those shapes, those things not only shape the landscape, but they also populate it. But they populate it with their children. Now, one of the things is that, of course, there's an enormous sense of relationship to the land. If you're Hawaiian and you're one of Kamapuaa's kids and you're living in Kahana, that's like living in your great grandma's house. He built it, he put it there, he put you there, he put your family there. And of course, since these are God figures, they don't die, they're still around. So the families that live there, at least two traditional families I know, they still see Kamapuaa as existing in the landscape. If you go back in the valley, especially just in dark falls, you might bump into either a really, really large pig that has red glowing eyes, or you might bump into a really tall, big Hawaiian guy who's not particularly friendly, who when he turns around, you notice on his back, he's got hair growing all the way down his back. Both of those are just Kamapuaa taking one of his other forms. So one of the other key aspects of clan is not only was it something that happened once upon a time or in the past, like God made the earth, or once upon a time. There actually, these things still exist now, and so they are the only owners of place. In the traditional Polynesian landscape, including Hawaii, people could not own real estate. People could not own land. The land was owned by the gods, but everyone was tied to a particular god because that was their ancestor, and he or she made particular places. If you're one of the 3 or 4 families in Kaunakakai and Molokai, you're the descendant of the shark god, one of Pele's brothers, whose name escapes me right now, who lives in the caverns or the tunnels underneath, caves underneath the Kaunakakai. And so therefore, obviously, you don't eat sharks, you don't hunt sharks, you go swim and play with sharks. And your elder brothers are sharks, and you are the keiki, the children of the shark god. And he made that landscape. Now, one of the aspects that gets really, I think, hard for people to grasp then, however, and this is certainly true in my background, is that if you belong to a clan, your sense of people is limited to your clan and maybe other clans you feel you're related to. So there's no idea of the human species. You don't have this whole sort of West Asian religious concept that people, the human species, is a particular thing. So beloved of the Western religious text, which is basically, God made man and put him in stewardship over everything else. So beloved of the Calvinist. That's not true at all in a Hawaiian landscape. In a Hawaiian landscape, each chunk of property was made by a thing. There are people that live on thing because they're children of that thing. They might not have particularly good or relationships with other groups, but they don't see the other groups as really being people. So one of the side effects of this is you tend to have a very, very, very intimate relationship with the land around you because it's yours, in the sense that you live on it. But you're not going to have a particularly intimate relationship with other pieces of property because they're not part of your world. Your world is defined by your ancestor. And it also means that you can end up with a tremendous amount of conflict within folks who are speaking the same language, living in the same area, because your clan and their clan at some point might have gone to battle. So, for example, you're not going to find a lot of folks who are still identifying with Kamapuaa hanging around in Ka'u or Pahoa on the Big Island, because that's Pele's property. And given the bad past history of those two gods, or Akua, you're not going to have their descendants being friends with each other if they're really traditionalists, because those are antithetical, because their great great grandparents, the god ancestors, wouldn't approve. So the living are controlled by the non-living. I'm not sure how you want to phrase it. They're not dead; they're still around. Um, so this was the key one. The term in Samoa was Ainga. And you still see this throughout all of Polynesia. It's heavily modified because in most of Polynesia, they become very westernized, especially Europeanized. And so the idea of clan has largely lost a lot of its legal, political implications. But socially, many people still see themselves this way. And certainly until the mid 19th century, this was the way the world functioned. So the concept of clan is really, really a key one. It's important to understand that vast majority of world's populations live in some sort of clan system. And what it means is you don't have a concept of the human species. You don't have an equivalent to the 10 commandments. What you have is a very strict set of rules that applies to people within the clan, but in many cases, almost no rules to anyone outside the clan. Now, if you remember right at the beginning, I was talking about Japanese houses or Asian houses, how you have to step over to get inside, the inside and the outside. The outside is the area that's not controlled by the clan in most of Asia. Coming across that doorstep, coming into a house or into a temple, is coming into an area of control, which is controlled by the clan, by the family, by the ancestor. And so this is sort of one of the best sort of, visual, physical reminders of this power concept of clan.